A professor at Columbia University looked down on and tried to publicly humiliate a black female student, a single mother, in front of the entire class, never expecting that she was, in fact, one of America's greatest mathematical geniuses. If that gave you chills, don't forget to like, drop your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and stick around, because the full story will blow your mind. On a gray and misty morning, the cold fluorescent lights bathed the vast lecture hall in a sterile glow as students trickled into their seats for advanced calculus at Columbia University. More than 100 undergrads settled into the theater-style rows, unzipping backpacks, flicking open laptops, and nervously flipping through notebooks, bracing themselves for the intellectual gauntlet that was Professor Linda Cartwright's class. But today wasn't just any lecture. In the first few rows, a panel of faculty members from multiple departments sat like jurors at a trial. They weren't there to observe. They were there to judge. This was Cartwright's infamous open lecture, where she showcased her ruthlessness and weeded out the weak. To these scholars, Cartwright's severity wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. In their minds, mathematics was a meritocracy for the elite. Anyone who couldn't keep up didn't belong. Near the middle of the room, a quiet young woman hunched over her desk, gently spinning a pen between her fingers. She kept to herself, spoke to no one. Her name was Naomi Reed. Naomi wore a plain sweatshirt, worn-out jeans, and had a well-kept spiral notebook filled with rows of sharp, elegant handwriting. She didn't seek attention. She never needed it. The equations in her head spoke louder than any voice ever could. But to some in the room, the sight of her dark skin and down-turned gaze was all the evidence they needed to pass judgment. Worse yet, whispers had already spread through campus that Naomi was the girl who had gotten into Columbia with twins on the way. Unmarried, no father in sight. Professor Whitaker sat in the front row, arms crossed, eyes full of disdain. "That's her," he muttered under his breath, a bitter grin curling across his face. "The girl with the kids, single mom in Calculus 4. This'll be a short ride." A few colleagues nearby chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Math isn't built for people like her. Special is black one added. The chuckles spread softly across the row like a contagion. It wasn't math they were dissecting. It was her. Naomi heard none of it, but she had heard it all before. She knew what they expected, that she'd crumble, that she'd break. What none of them knew was that today they'd gamble on her failure and lose everything. The air stiffened as the clicking of heels sliced through the hall like a metronome of authority. Professor Cartwright entered, steel-spined and perfectly composed. Her tailored blazer, silver glasses, and razor-sharp eyes gave the impression that she'd already graded the room before even speaking. Her silence demanded obedience. The class fell into dead quiet. Not a whisper, not a shuffling page. Just the sound of her heels striking polished tile. She walked with the certainty of a general inspecting troops, scanning the lecture hall with surgical detachment. Her gaze landed briefly on Naomi, cold, calculating, as if to say, "Do you really believe you belong in my world?" She narrowed her eyes, then looked away, dismissing Naomi as quickly as she had judged her. No one noticed that flicker of condescension, but Naomi did. Turning toward the blackboard, Cartwright picked up a piece of chalk and began to write with swift, decisive strokes. "Last week," she announced with clipped precision, "we explored multivariable limits. Today we begin Laplace transforms." Complex expressions unfolded on the board like a foreign language. The students immediately scrambled to copy them down, racing to keep up with her pace. But it was more than just fast. It was brutal. Cartwright lectured with the clarity of a machine and the warmth of one too. From the first equation, several students were already lost, but none dared speak. In Cartwright's room, failure was your fault, and your silence was survival. A few of the guest professors nodded with satisfaction. They weren't just impressed by the math, they were thrilled by the cruelty. To them, real educators didn't lift struggling students up. They cut them loose. Naomi, meanwhile, didn't write. She watched. Her eyes moved over each formula with practiced patience, like someone rereading a favorite novel. The math wasn't overwhelming, it was familiar. But then she narrowed her eyes. Something was off. No one seemed to notice. Everyone was just copying down like machines, not really understanding what was happening. Cartwright pressed on with her lecture, each stroke of chalk confident and sharp, as though she'd never once erred in her entire academic career. But Naomi's eyes were locked on the board, scanning the equation with growing certainty. It wouldn't have an immediate effect, but if continued, the final result would be completely wrong. She hesitated. Speaking up meant stepping into the spotlight. And Cartwright? She wasn't known for welcoming correction, especially not in front of an audience of fellow professors. She wielded control like a weapon and didn't suffer challenges lightly. But Naomi understood something else. Cartwright wasn't the only one in that room carrying bias. That whole front row of visiting faculty had already dismissed her from the moment she walked in, eyes narrowing not just at her skin, but at the rumors. Naomi could have stayed quiet, let it go, let the moment pass. But the idea of letting arrogance win turned her stomach. She despised that kind of certainty, the kind built not on facts, but on ego, the kind that looked at her and saw nothing more than a statistic. She took a deep breath and raised her hand, her voice steady but low. "Professor, I believe there's a mistake in the transformation." The air turned dense, thick with disbelief. Cartwright froze mid-sentence. The classroom sank into silence so complete it seemed to have its own gravity. Every eye turned toward Naomi. But it wasn't the students' attention that held weight. It was Cartwright's slow, deliberate smile. Not warm, not kind. The smile of a predator eyeing prey foolish enough to step into its territory. She turned slowly, as though savoring the moment. "A mistake, you say?" Her voice was calm, even pleasant, but beneath it was an edge as sharp as broken glass. She glanced at the board, barely even pretending to check, then turned back to Naomi. "Are you certain?" Some professors exchanged glances. A few smirked. In the front row, one leaned toward Whitaker and whispered, "Told you. She's just dug her own grave." Whitaker's smirk deepened, arms folded, eyes gleaming. "Let's watch her drown." Naomi didn't blink. She met Cartwright's stare head-on. "Yes, I'm sure." For the briefest second, something in Cartwright's expression faltered, just enough to reveal that she was thinking, recalculating. The quiet in the lecture hall deepened. Even the rustling of papers stopped. The keystrokes faded. Only Cartwright's cold stare remained, fixed on Naomi like a scalpel about to make an incision. "Do you think?" Cartwright asked, voice as flat and cutting as a steel blade. "Or do you know?" A girl in the back row faltered, stammering nervously. I just thought..." Cartwright's response sliced the air. "If you're not sure, don't waste my time." The student shrank into her chair, face flushed with humiliation, her voice crushed under the weight of the rebuke. No one moved. No one wanted to be next. Naomi exhaled slowly, eyes still calm. She had seen this kind of professor before, ones who treated challenge as insolence and curiosity as insubordination. She wasn't afraid of them. Not anymore. She raised her hand again. The whispers died instantly. Cartwright's brow arched ever so slightly. She wasn't surprised, not quite, but she wasn't pleased either. Her expression flattened, poker-faced now, like a dealer waiting for a losing player to bet everything on a weak hand. Naomi's voice didn't shake. Actually, there's a flaw in the transformation step. The coefficient was introduced prematurely. The room stirred. Heads snapped toward her. The air changed. No longer was it filled with unease. It crackled with anticipation, not of learning, but of downfall. And the professors leaned in. Whitaker gave a dry chuckle. No humor in it, only venom. She thinks she's smarter than Cartwright? Another professor gave a slow nod, arms crossed, eyes glittering. This is gonna be fun. Cartwright didn't move, didn't blink. Her gaze stayed locked on Naomi, unmoving and unreadable, and Naomi held it, refusing to back down. The silence in the room hung deliberately, stretched like an invisible thread, as though Cartwright was giving Naomi enough rope to tie her own noose. Then came the smile, not one of kindness or grace, but the smirk of someone basking in superiority. "Are you sure?" she asked again. But this time the words came wrapped in a warning, not a question. Naomi didn't waver. "Yes, I'm sure." Something flickered across Cartwright's face, barely there, gone in an instant. But Naomi caught it, a subtle crack in her polished armor. The professor's expression quickly snapped back into its usual stone-cold mask as she turned toward the board. The silence in the hall deepened again. Naomi didn't need to glance at the board. She already knew she was right, and others were starting to see it too. Whispers broke out in the back rows. A few students leaned forward, eyes darting between their notes and the chalked equations. And then, for the first time since the class began, one of the guest professors narrowed her gaze and began tracing the math for herself. Cartwright scrutinized the board line by line. Her chalk hand hovered, tense. She searched for a lifeline, some justification, some angle, but there was none. Naomi's correction was bulletproof. The error, though slight, was undeniable. And if Cartwright admitted it, she would surrender the one thing she guarded more fiercely than anything else: her dominance. The piece of chalk in Cartwright's hand trembled slightly before she turned around. The arrogance was gone from her smile, replaced with something unreadable. "Well then, if you're so certain," she said, her voice cool as glass. She extended the chalk. "Come fix it." Gasps rippled like a breeze across the room, followed by snickers that grew into hushed, giddy laughter. A few students exchanged wide-eyed looks. This wasn't an invitation. It was a test, a public trial. The real reactions, though, were in the front row. Whitaker shifted back in his seat, arms folded, his lips twisting into a crooked grin. "Now this is gonna be fun." Another professor leaned in, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. She just walked herself into a trap. They all knew Cartwright's tactics too well. This wasn't about teaching, it was about spectacle. Naomi was meant to be humiliated. Naomi stood slowly. She didn't look shaken, didn't utter a word. She walked down the aisle like a soldier approaching the front line, took the chalk from Cartwright's hand, and faced the board. She understood exactly what this moment was. It wasn't a correction. It wasn't about math. It was war. Cartwright didn't blink. Arms folded, her gaze bored into Naomi's back. She had seen overconfident students before, ones who thought a single correct answer gave them a place among giants. She had crushed them all. And this one? The girl with the rumors, the hoodie, and the unapologetic stare? She wouldn't be the exception. A low laugh echoed from Whitaker. He leaned toward his colleague and whispered, She really thinks she's got it. Wait till she trips. But Naomi wasn't listening. She faced the board, erased the flawed portion, and began rewriting with clarity and purpose. Her hand didn't tremble. Her mind didn't pause. Line by line, she replaced the mistake with an elegant, precise correction. The room shifted. Whispers evaporated. Laughter died. Now, they were watching. Students leaned forward, their eyes darting from their notes to the board. One kid blinked in confusion. "Wait, did she just fix it?" he whispered to no one in particular. Cartwright's arms tightened across her chest. Her jaw clenched. She couldn't stop it. Naomi had done it. She had corrected a mistake Cartwright never thought anyone would dare to touch, let alone fix. It was right there, in chalk and silence, undeniable. Cartwright could try to ignore it, twist the narrative, act like it was insignificant, but everyone in that room had seen it. She had made an error, and Naomi had exposed it. With lips pressed tight, Cartwright gave the smallest nod. Good. But Naomi noticed the tension in that word, the stiff grip of Cartwright's hands, and especially the fleeting glance she exchanged with Whitaker, a silent acknowledgement that this was far from over. Then, Cartwright turned to the board with a new fire in her eyes. She grabbed a fresh piece of chalk and began scrawling another problem, this one denser, faster, deliberately convoluted. Equations twisted and looped across the board like a mathematical labyrinth. The difficulty level shot up with every line. Students glanced around, confusion blooming in their expressions. The problem wasn't just hard, it was impossible to track in real time. Cartwright stepped back, dropped the chalk into the tray with a cold clink, and faced Naomi. "If you're really that impressive," she said with a razor smile, "then let's see what you do with this." The room erupted. Students gasped. A few giggled nervously. A visiting professor chuckled, almost gleeful. "Ah, now the real game begins." Whitaker nodded slowly, his voice dripping with smug certainty. "Bet she doesn't make it past the first line." Naomi studied the board. This wasn't undergrad territory anymore. This was graduate-level chaos, nested integrals, higher-order functions, non-linear transformations that could take doctoral students hours to decode. She knew what Cartwright was trying to do: rattle her, drown her in complexity, make her choke. But Cartwright didn't realize Naomi thrived in chaos. This was home. She stepped toward the board, her breath steady. The room hushed. Then, with no hesitation, Naomi raised the chalk and began. Her movements were smooth, deliberate. No stumbles, no rewrites. Just a clean, uninterrupted stream of thought translated into numbers and symbols. She didn't pause to ponder. She already knew. The path was clear in her head before she touched the board. The audience sat in stunned silence. Even the professors leaned forward. It was like watching a pianist at Carnegie Hall, hands moving effortlessly, each stroke hitting a perfect note. One student whispered, "She's actually doing it." Cartwright remained still, but her knuckles had turned white. Whitaker was no longer grinning. He stared, slack-jawed, as the girl he had written off tore through a problem that was meant to crush her. Naomi wrote the final line, set the chalk down, took one step back, and turned. The classroom felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. All eyes darted between her and the board, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. "What just happened?" someone muttered. A professor adjusted his glasses, scanning the solution with clinical disbelief. He found nothing. No errors, no guesswork, just clarity. Cartwright stood frozen. Her silence screamed louder than any lecture. She searched for anything she could use to dismiss Naomi. A crack, a flaw, a misplaced coefficient. But there was nothing. Because Naomi Reed had just done the impossible and made sure everyone saw it. At the back of the lecture hall, a student let out a low whistle, a sharp sound that sliced through the heavy stillness. Other whispers followed, not filled with sarcasm or disbelief this time, but with something far rarer in that classroom: awe. For the first time, admiration echoed across a space that had only ever rewarded silence or submission. Admiration for a girl no one had bet on. Admiration for Naomi Reed, the one Professor Cartwright had deemed forgettable. At the front, Whitaker no longer wore his smug little grin. He leaned in toward the desk, elbows pressing down as if grounding himself against what he was seeing. His eyes narrowed, no longer with mockery but with something quieter, unsettled confusion bordering on fear. "No way," he murmured under his breath. "No way she's actually this good." Cartwright finally broke the silence, but her voice was stripped of the steel it usually carried. "Well, not bad." The words were dry, hollow, empty of warmth or anger, but no one missed the discomfort beneath them. Her tone betrayed her. She wanted to dismiss what had just happened, but how could she, when every single pair of eyes in that room had seen the same thing? Naomi hadn't just passed a test. She had obliterated it, rewritten the balance of the room. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't need to. As she walked back to her seat, the room remained spellbound. Every gaze clung to her like static, stunned and searching for understanding. Cartwright clenched her hand around the chalk so tightly her knuckles went pale. She couldn't let this end like that. If Naomi had survived that problem, she would raise the bar to a height no student, freshman or not, could leap. Without a word, Cartwright turned back to the board. "Let's see," she muttered, almost to herself, "what you'll do with this." The silence returned, taut as a string stretched too far. Every student's focus still lingered on the equation Naomi had just completed, flawless, irrefutable. Even Whitaker couldn't hide his agitation anymore. One eyebrow twitched upward. His fingers tapped anxiously on the desk like a ticking metronome. "There's no way," he whispered, not even to anyone in particular. "She must have studied that one in advance." The professor beside him didn't respond, only gave a tight nod, jaw locked in disbelief. They wouldn't say it aloud, but the truth sat between them like a verdict. They had misjudged Naomi Reed. But Cartwright wasn't ready to concede. She couldn't afford to. She marched over to the lectern, pulled out a heavy calculus tome, one of those brick-sized volumes reserved for doctoral programs, and let its weight slam down onto the desk. This wouldn't be just another equation. This would be the edge of reason. Flipping toward the final chapters, she found what she wanted, then turned the book outward toward the class, toward Naomi. "Solve this," she said. The air changed instantly. Whispers broke like storm waves across the lecture hall. Students craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the problem. One gasped, "No way, that's PhD level." Another leaned toward a friend and whispered, "She's trying to break her." Even one of the visiting professors chuckled, but not with cruelty. This time it was genuine curiosity. "Well," he murmured, "let's see if she's gifted, or just lucky." Cartwright didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked on Naomi, sharp, cold, and expectant. She was waiting for hesitation, for panic, for the inevitable crack. But Naomi just smiled. It wasn't smug. It wasn't even bold. It was calm, serene in a way that unnerved Cartwright more than anger ever could. Naomi rose, walked toward the board with quiet certainty, and picked up the chalk like she had been waiting for this moment all along. A few students inhaled sharply. Others chuckled nervously, unsure if they were witnessing courage or insanity. But the moment Naomi touched the chalk to the board, the uncertainty disappeared. She moved quickly, more fluidly than before. There was no stalling, no second guessing. It was as if she had already solved the problem in her head before she'd even touched the board. The symbols flowed from her hand with terrifying clarity. Transformations snapped into place like a machine tuned to perfection. Every operation was efficient. Nothing wasted. Cartwright's gaze narrowed to a razor's edge. This wasn't what she'd planned. She wanted Naomi to flinch, to pause, to furrow her brow and fumble for the next step. But instead, Naomi's hand moved faster than it had during the last problem, like the challenge itself had unlocked something deeper in her. Students exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, some quietly amazed. They weren't just watching someone solve a problem. They were witnessing a rewriting of expectations. "She's not solving it," one student whispered. "She's rewriting it." And it was true. Naomi wasn't just answering a question. She was refining it, simplifying what should have taken an hour down to minutes. Whitaker's fingers stopped tapping. Cartwright's hands curled tighter behind her back. And Naomi? She just kept writing. Some students began exchanging looks, disbelief written across their faces like someone had just rewritten gravity. A visiting professor tilted his head, his brows inching upward with something nearing respect. "This can't be real," someone whispered, barely audible. Whitaker clenched his fist without realizing it, the color draining slowly from his face. The frustration he'd worn so comfortably gave way to something deeper, unease, edged with a fear he didn't want to name. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered. Naomi kept writing, stroke by stroke, symbol by symbol, as if the room didn't exist, as if she couldn't feel every eye trained on her like a spotlight. But she felt it. She felt Cartwright's composure beginning to unravel. She felt Whitaker's certainty rot into dread. And God, she savored it. 1 minute passed, then another. Cartwright's hand clenched into a fist so tight her knuckles paled, the smugness drained from her face. What replaced it was something Naomi hadn't seen until now: worry. Because Cartwright realized she had miscalculated. She hadn't merely challenged Naomi, she had handed her a stage. And now, the entire lecture hall had front-row seats to a performance they'd never forget. Naomi set the chalk down. She stepped back from the board, arms folded calmly across her chest, her eyes clear and unflinching. She had finished. And the silence that followed wasn't uncertainty. It was awe. One of the guest professors exhaled softly and looked up at the board again, as if to reassure himself it was real. Cartwright didn't move. Whitaker didn't blink. The entire front row sat in stone-faced silence. There was no way to dismiss it as luck. There were no flaws to question. Naomi Reed had just solved a doctoral-level equation, publicly, flawlessly, and there was no room left for doubt. The click of chalk falling into the tray rang out like a gavel striking judgment. Naomi turned around and looked directly at Cartwright. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Everything she had to say was already etched across the blackboard in perfect logic and undeniable proof. It wasn't just a correction. It was a declaration. Cartwright remained frozen, lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, maybe to downplay it, maybe to reclaim control. But no words came. Because she knew the truth. She had expected Naomi to trip, to panic, to crumble. Instead, Naomi had answered a problem meant to break her the way one might tie their shoes. Effortlessly. Cartwright had no choice now but to face what she'd refused to believe. Naomi wasn't just capable. She was extraordinary. Then, a single clap cut through the silence. One of the visiting professors, his eyes locked on Cartwright, clapped. Not for Naomi, but for the professor's stunned silence. Another clap followed. then a third. And like a wave catching momentum, the applause rolled across the hall, students rising from their seats one by one. It started as shock. Then it became recognition. And finally, it erupted into full, unfiltered respect. Hands slammed desks. Students cheered. Even those who'd scoffed at Naomi just hours ago now looked at her with something closer to reverence. Cartwright's hands tightened at her sides. She had lost, and not just the battle on the board. She had lost in her own kingdom, on her own terms, in front of the same people who once applauded her tyranny. What hurt most wasn't the loss itself. It was the permanence of it. There was nothing she could do to rewrite what had just happened. Whitaker looked like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water in his face. All trace of arrogance had vanished, replaced with stiff discomfort and something else. Fear. He opened his mouth, hoping to conjure a quip, a dismissal, any line to spin this back in their favor. But there was nothing. There were no mistakes to spotlight, no errors to stretch. Naomi had burned the excuses down to ash. She had won. In the middle of the applause, Naomi didn't grin. She didn't soak it in. She just stood there, serene, steady, grounded. Because she understood something the others didn't. Real victory didn't scream. It didn't beg for recognition. Real victory lived in silence, the kind that followed those who used to doubt you and could no longer look away. Eventually, Cartwright cleared her throat. "Not bad," she said. 3 words. Cold. Hollow. A last line of defense. Not praise. Not admission. Just a verbal band-aid over a wound too deep to hide. Naomi gave a faint nod. She didn't need more. She didn't need validation from people who had spent the whole semester pretending she didn't exist. The board behind her already told the truth. And truth doesn't require applause. Still, the students stood, clapping. Some looked at Cartwright, and for the first time, not with reverence but with something else. Curiosity. Doubt. The kind that whispers, maybe she's not always right. Because a girl Cartwright had once ignored just forced her into silence in front of the entire world. Cartwright locked eyes with Naomi, her stare digging deep, searching, begging for some final crack in the girl's armor. But there was nothing to be found. Because Naomi hadn't won today simply by being brilliant. She had won because she refused to let anyone define her worth. She had rewritten the rules, on their board, in their language, in front of their eyes. And then, without a word, Cartwright turned away, pacing back to the lectern in a silence that thundered louder than any scolding. No justification. No apology, not even a reluctant nod. Just a long, frozen silence. A silence that confessed her defeat in full. Whitaker pushed back his chair and stood, but stayed quiet. He knew anything he said now would only spotlight their loss. Naomi slid back into her seat without a sound, didn't glance at a soul. She opened her notebook, flipped calmly through its pages, as though she'd just finished solving a warm-up problem, not dismantling the power structure of the entire room. But everyone knew. It hadn't just been a math problem. It was a turning point. A reckoning. One Cartwright, Whitaker, and every other doubter would carry with them forever. Behind the lectern, Cartwright sat motionless. But inside, she was seething. She could handle a gifted student. What she couldn't accept was being humiliated by one, especially not in front of her peers. Naomi hadn't just corrected her. She had done it publicly, gracefully, and worst of all, without arrogance. It had shaken the room. It had shaken her. The whispers among students had already shifted. From admiration to questions. Questions about Cartwright's authority, about her fallibility, And that, to her, was unacceptable. She couldn't let Naomi leave the classroom triumphant. She needed to pull her into a contest she couldn't win, a test so demanding that even brilliance would break under pressure. Cartwright stood slowly, walking toward the center of the room with a calculated composure. She wasn't angry. She smiled, thin, deliberate. A smile that said, "I've found a new way to bury you." "Well done, Naomi," she said, her tone unnervingly soft, almost warm, but the weight behind it heavy with implication. "I'll admit, you've surprised me." Gasps whispered through the lecture hall. A few students turned to each other, stunned. "Did she just praise her?" someone muttered under their breath. But Naomi wasn't fooled. That wasn't praise. It was bait. Cartwright turned, taking a few steps back toward the lectern, then let her palm rest on a stack of textbooks as she continued, her voice smooth and sweet, like poisoned honey. "Of course, real talent doesn't just belong in the classroom," she said, casting Naomi a sharp glance. "And with skills like yours, I imagine a board of equations must be getting a little limiting." The tension in the room thickened. Why not step into something more real? Students began to shift in their seats, heads tilted, breath caught. They knew where this was going. Cartwright let the pause linger before dropping it. "There's a national math competition next month. The most brilliant students in the country, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, you name it, they'll be there. And they're not just solving equations under pressure. They're competing for a prize pool worth over $30,000. She let the number hang in the air before driving the knife in. Imagine what that kind of money could do for someone who has responsibilities. Say, 2 little ones waiting at home. The room turned cold. A few students gasped. Someone whispered, "No, she didn't." Naomi froze, just for a moment. Her throat caught. Her hands, once resting calmly on the desk, curled slightly. Cartwright tilted her head, eyes gleaming. "You've been the talk of the faculty lounge, Naomi. The girl with the twins and no ring." She smiled, cruel and composed. "It takes strength to balance equations and baby bottles, doesn't it?" Naomi stood slowly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but unwavering. "Yeah," she said, meeting Cartwright's gaze. "I have 2 children. I'm a single mom, and I'll take that challenge." The lecture hall erupted. Some students gasped. Others clapped a hand to their mouths. A wave of murmurs washed through the room like a breaking tide. "She said yes?" one student hissed. "No hesitation," another whispered. "She just owned it." Cartwright's lips twitched, as if trying to mask the surprise. She had expected a stumble. She had expected shame. She had expected Naomi to cower under the weight of that truth. But Naomi hadn't flinched. She'd claimed it, owned it, and then stepped straight into the fire. Naomi didn't sit down. She didn't blink. She just stood there, head high, letting the weight of the moment settle around her like armor. And the entire room knew. They weren't just watching a student anymore. They were watching a warrior. Cartwright arched an eyebrow, clearly expecting Naomi to hesitate, to stumble, to weigh her options, to crack beneath the pressure she had just planted in front of her like a minefield. But Naomi didn't flinch. She simply said, "All right, I'll do it," with the calm certainty of someone who'd already made peace with the storm. She sat down slowly, not with defiance, not with pride, but with a kind of quiet readiness that unnerved even Cartwright. Naomi knew exactly what the professor was doing, trying to push her toward a cliff. But what Cartwright didn't understand was that Naomi hadn't agreed to prove anything to her. She had accepted because deep down, she knew this was the world she belonged in, the world where the best of the best gathered. She had always known. Cartwright stood frozen, her arms by her side, her expression unreadable, though something twisted faintly in her gut. It wasn't anger. It wasn't victory. It was doubt. For the first time, she wondered, did I just challenge the wrong person? Word of Naomi Reed's decision tore through Columbia like wildfire. At first, it buzzed through lecture halls in half sentences and wide-eyed whispers. But within a day, it was everywhere, from the booths in the campus cafes to the steps of Butler Library. The first-year math student, the one with twins at home and a head full of numbers, had stepped into the ring against the nation's sharpest minds. And she didn't blink. Some students were electrified by it, calling her a legend in the making. "She's breaking down walls," someone said. "Barriers that were never supposed to move." Others rolled their eyes. "She's biting off more than she can chew," they muttered, placing quiet bets on how quickly she'd fall apart. After all, this competition wasn't just hard, it was legendary. Most of the names on that roster had been doing proofs before they hit puberty. Some trained under Ivy League mentors, others had their names on published research. And then there was Naomi. Whitaker remained unimpressed. "She won't last," he told a colleague flatly. "She doesn't have the background. She doesn't have the pedigree. She's a spark, not a fire. Give it time. She'll burn out." But Naomi wasn't chasing validation. She wasn't chasing anyone. All she wanted was the win, for her kids. And so, with the whole campus watching, she buried herself in preparation. 28 days, hundreds of hours. The library became her sanctuary, her battleground. Each morning she arrived before sunrise, juggling textbooks, highlighters, and half-finished peanut butter sandwiches stuffed into her backpack beside an old baby monitor. She opened her laptop, found the most punishing problems from past international math competitions, pulled theories from advanced graduate papers, and dove in like she had nothing left to lose. There were days she didn't sleep. Nights she stayed up solving integrals while rocking a feverish child in one arm and gripping a pencil in the other. Sometimes her hands shook from exhaustion. Once she passed out at the kitchen table, waking up with formula spilled on her notes. But every time she thought she was done, she remembered the rent, the smell of mildew in the hallway of their apartment, the bunk beds she wanted to replace, the school she wanted her twins to grow up in. And that made her sharpen her pencil and keep going. Math wasn't just numbers to her. It was a ticket, a way out, a key. She didn't just solve problems. She dismantled them, deconstructed them, built shortcuts where others hadn't even seen doorways. If a theorem had 5 possible solutions, she found all 5. If a problem could be reversed and solved backwards, she tested it. She studied math like it was a map, because for her, it was. One day, while working through a particularly brutal system of non-linear transformations, her friend Jasmine walked up behind her and stared, stunned. "Girl, do you even sleep anymore?" Naomi didn't look up. "I'll sleep after we get a new apartment." Jasmine dropped into the chair next to her, shaking her head. "You're turning into a damn machine." Naomi paused her writing, then met Jasmine's gaze with something cold and steady. "I can't afford not to win," Jasmine exhaled. "You know this competition. It's not just smart kids. It's savants. Kids trained since they were in diapers." "I know," Naomi replied. "They breathe math." "Exactly," Jasmine said. "They don't mess up." Naomi didn't blink. "Good," she whispered. "Neither do I." Meanwhile, Cartwright wasn't sitting idle. She didn't truly believe Naomi had a chance, but she wasn't about to let her name be tied to a student who collapsed on a national stage. She compiled a packet of problems, far more brutal than anything Naomi would face in the real competition. Not to support her, but to crush her. Quietly, privately. She wanted Naomi to quit before the spotlight ever turned on. But Naomi didn't quit. She tore through every problem in the packet like it was her birthright. What Cartwright saw as punishment, Naomi treated like warm-up drills. She broke through limits she hadn't even known she had. She didn't just learn how to solve problems. Naomi learned how to obliterate them with surgical precision. She drilled relentlessly, stopwatch in hand, chasing every second as if her children's future depended on it. Because it did. She trained herself not only to be right, but to be fast. Ruthlessly fast. She studied the mental patterns of former champions, dissected their strategies, traced their logic step by step until it became second nature. She didn't just absorb knowledge, she devoured it, turning every formula into fuel, every theorem into a tool sharper than the last. From the shadows, Whitaker kept watching, waiting for a crack to form. He expected her to break down, to cave under the weight, to give up. But the girl just wouldn't crack. With every day, she got faster, sharper, more focused. His silence turned from condescension to quiet disbelief. Every attempt to shake her resolve had failed. Naomi was no longer studying for a competition. She was preparing for war. And the battlefield was drawing near. The date of the National Mathematics Championship loomed, and the tension across the Columbia campus grew thick with speculation. In department meetings, professors braced themselves for the embarrassment they assumed would follow. In dorm rooms, some students whispered about the inevitable fall. But Naomi didn't wait around for their doubts to become facts. She just kept going. Because for her, a single month, if used right, was enough to turn an entire world upside down. And she was ready to do just that. When the day arrived, the grand lecture hall at the University of Pennsylvania was a crucible of intellect. The air felt heavy, saturated with quiet ambition and sharpened nerves. This wasn't some local quiz bowl. This was the crown jewel of national academic combat. The best and brightest from MIT, Stanford, Princeton, Caltech, and Harvard were there, dressed in muted confidence and bearing the cool composure of seasoned champions. Naomi entered the room like a wave moving against the current. She felt hundreds of eyes pierce her the moment she crossed the threshold. Some held curiosity, others suspicion, and more than a few, especially those cloaked in legacy and name-brand education, looked at her with naked disdain. At the front of the room, Professor Cartwright sat stiffly at the judges' table, flanked by titans of academia. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes swept over Naomi like a searchlight, still clinging to hope that this girl would finally fold. In the back corner, Whitaker stood with his arms folded, watching her every step like a man waiting for gravity to do its job. If she fails, he thought, I won't even have to say it. The silence will prove me right. Naomi didn't look at them, didn't need to. She had done the work. She had wrestled every doubt, endured every sleepless night, solved problem after problem while her babies slept in the next room. She was no longer afraid. A voice came through the loudspeaker, pulling every mind in the room back into the present. Welcome, competitors, to the final round of the National Mathematics Championship. In this room sit the most gifted mathematical thinkers of your generation, but today, only one will emerge as the best. All eyes turned to the projection screen, and just like that, it began. The first question lit up the room like a fuse. Triple integrals, Fourier expansions, nested derivatives, high-level Laplace transforms, nonlinear equations so thick with complexity they looked like coded incantations. Pencils hovered. Some hands twitched. One contestant bit his lip. They weren't playing anymore. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't look left, didn't look right. She didn't measure herself by the tension on anyone else's face. She read the question, and then she wrote. Her pen moved as if it had been waiting for this moment. No hesitation, no overthinking, just pure execution. Numbers poured across her paper in perfect sequence, each transformation purposeful, each step trimmed of excess. Others paused to recheck their work, whispering to themselves, rereading the prompts with panicked eyes. But Naomi never looked back. She'd already solved it in her mind the second the screen blinked. Cartwright, from her seat at the front, checked the clock. Her lips pressed together. Naomi was ahead. Way ahead. A professor from Stanford leaned toward his colleague, whispering, "Who is that girl? And why does she look like she's done this 100 times? "I don't know," the other murmured. "But she's not just here for show." The difficulty only increased. With each round, fewer competitors continued writing. Some lowered their pens, dazed by the unsolvable. Others simply stared at their pages, hoping clarity would arrive through divine mercy. But two remained, Naomi and a PhD candidate from MIT. A boy who had been raised on proofs, who had dined with math Olympiad coaches, who had never lost a competition in his life. He was calm, precise, deadly, and Cartwright saw in him the rival she'd been counting on. She leaned back slightly, finally allowing herself a faint smile. "If anyone's going to take her down," she thought, "it'll be him." Whitaker, arms crossed in the back, nodded slowly, his smirk returning. "She's good," he thought, "but this is where she hits her ceiling." Then the final question appeared. The room froze. This wasn't a test anymore. This was war disguised as mathematics, a problem layered with deception, demanding creativity, endurance, and the kind of precision that took a lifetime to develop. The MIT student's eyes narrowed. He picked up his pen first, eyebrows pulled tight in focus. Naomi didn't move, at least not right away. She gave the question a long look, let the structure settle in her mind like music, and then, almost casually, she picked up her pen, because she saw the answer already. The real showdown had begun. Pens moved at a blistering pace, so rapid that even the judges leaned in, caught off guard by the velocity. Pages filled with numbers, formulas, and seamless transformations. There was no time to pause, no room for uncertainty. This wasn't just a math contest anymore, it was a duel. A professor from Princeton leaned close and whispered, This is what genius looks like." The soft scratch of pen against paper became the only sound in the hall. No one spoke. No one dared to even shift in their chair. Time bled forward. The MIT PhD, ice calm and razor-focused, was closing in on the solution. Cartwright's gaze landed on him, her lips curling ever so slightly. "This is the one," she thought. "This is who will finally stop her." And then, a gasp from the judge's table. Naomi had stopped. He was still writing. She was done. No scribbled-out errors, no hesitation. She capped her pen, set it gently on the desk, and leaned back, arms folded, her expression composed and unreadable. Whitaker sat upright like someone had yanked his spine straight. Cartwright's hands clenched at the edge of the table. The entire row of judges turned, eyes narrowing in her direction. One judge rose, walked slowly to Naomi's desk. The entire hall held its breath. He bent, reviewed the solution, line by line. When he straightened again, his eyes were wide with astonishment. He didn't need to speak. The room knew. Naomi hadn't just solved the final problem. She had solved it flawlessly, with elegance and clarity that bordered on art. The MIT student was still writing, oblivious to the fact that the race had already ended. Naomi had won. In that instant, Cartwright felt the weight of her own miscalculations settle like a boulder in her chest. She had underestimated not just a student, but a force. The air in the auditorium seemed frozen when the results of the penultimate round were announced. Naomi's answer hadn't just been correct. It had been the most refined, most insightful solution submitted. Judges who had entered the room with furrowed brows now glanced at each other in stunned silence. Cartwright's grip tightened on the table's edge, knuckles turning white. She couldn't hide the discomfort anymore. A creeping sense of something unfamiliar curled inside her. Fear. Whitaker, stiff and seething, leaned over to whisper something to the judge beside him. The judge simply shook his head. There was nothing left to say. Naomi's result couldn't be argued. It stood on its own, undeniable. And still, it wasn't over. The lead judge stood, stepping to the center of the stage. His voice rang out, clear and resonant. "We now move to the final round." The hall braced. Hundreds of students, professors, and guests held their breath. Everyone knew this would be no ordinary test. Eyes turned to the massive screen as the final problem revealed itself. An entangled mess of non-linear differentials, layered transformations, and nested constraints that resembled chaos more than calculation. It was the kind of challenge that made industry experts sweat. This wasn't just difficult. This was a monster. Contestants froze. Some rubbed their temples. Others exchanged looks that said, "We're doomed." Even the MIT PhD, who'd worn his composure like armor all day, took several moments before lowering his pen to the paper. Naomi didn't rush. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes scanning the entire equation. No panic, no doubt, just quiet, deliberate observation. She wasn't reading, she was listening. And then, she saw it. The pattern. The key no one else had spotted. The timer started. Contestants lunged into action, but chaos quickly followed. Frowns deepened. Erasers flew. Steps were retraced. Some reached dead ends and started over, pages growing messy with frustration. Even the MIT student, the pride of polished institutions, had slowed. His pen still moved, but the clarity was gone. His lips tightened, his jaw tensed. Cartwright watched the room like a hawk, eyes darting from student to student, until finally landing on Naomi. She smirked. "This is it," she thought. "No one can power through this, not even her. This is where she breaks." But then, Naomi gently set her pen down. The auditorium froze again. She wasn't writing, not because she had given up, but because she was finished. While others labored through every step, Naomi sat still, reviewing her work one final time. She inhaled slowly, then leaned back in her chair. The judges, stunned, left their seats again, walking toward her desk with a sense of urgency. They didn't believe it. No one could have finished that fast. The problem had been engineered to push the very limits of cognition. But as they reviewed Naomi's paper, their expressions shifted. They weren't just impressed, they were shaken. She hadn't only solved it, she had solved it differently. While others brute forced their way through the jungle, Naomi had found a path no one else had even seen. An entirely new approach, cleaner, faster, bolder. The MIT professor was still writing, unaware that he had lost. Cartwright could no longer stay seated. She leaned forward, fingers clasped tightly, her eyes locked on Naomi's paper, as if sheer force of will could reveal a flaw. She searched, desperate, scanning every line for a misstep, any misstep. But there was none. Not only was Naomi's answer correct, it was brilliant in a way no one else had seen coming. She hadn't just cracked an impossible problem. She had reimagined how it could be solved. A judge looked up from her paper, his voice echoing through the tense air, calm but commanding, shattering the stillness. "We have a winner." The hall erupted. Students shot up from their seats, applause breaking out like thunder across the room. On stage, the MIT competitor froze, stunned mid-scribble, his eyes widening as he realized Naomi had finished before he'd even made it past the final turn. In the front row, Whitaker sat stiffly, unmoving, the color draining from his face. Cartwright didn't blink. She just stared at the girl she had tried to break and now couldn't deny. And for the first time, she realized she hadn't simply lost a bet on a student. She had lost a world view. Naomi didn't leap from her seat. She didn't raise her fists or soak in the applause like a queen returning from war. She simply looked at Cartwright. That same calm, composed stare she'd given her the first day they met. A stare that needed no words. A stare that said, "I didn't come here for your approval. I came to tell the truth, and I let the math do it." Cartwright couldn't change it. Not anymore. Naomi Reed wasn't just talented. She was undeniable. The crowd roared louder as the head judge stood, adjusted his glasses, and held up the final solution sheet. "She didn't just get it right," he said, his voice filled with awe. "She took an entirely different path, one cleaner, smarter, more efficient." Whispers spread like fire across the room, from the students in the back row to the professors on the front bench. People leaned into one another, eyebrows raised, jaws slack, eyes wide. They didn't speak, but their looks said it all. One judge gently placed Naomi's paper on the podium and stepped forward. "The winner of this year's National Mathematics Championship is..." He paused, letting the weight of the moment land across every heart in the room. "Naomi Reed." And the hall exploded. Cheers crashed like waves. Students jumped from their seats, hands clapped until they turned red. The disbelief that had once filled the room was now replaced with something else: reverence. Some shook their heads in wonder. Others simply stared, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. At the judges' table, Cartwright still hadn't moved. Her usual sharp eyes now seemed vacant, as if she'd been drained of certainty. She had come prepared to prove that Naomi didn't belong, but now, the only person who had been proven wrong was her. Naomi had not only won, she had changed the rules. Whitaker remained frozen, one hand still gripping the armrest, his mouth tight with defeat. He had once believed that only the chosen, the privileged, the pedigreed, had the right to sit at the summit of academia. But now that belief lay shattered beneath Naomi's feet. She hadn't needed connections. She hadn't needed endorsements. She hadn't needed to wear a legacy name like armor. She had walked in with nothing but a pen, a problem, and 2 children waiting at home, and it had been enough. Naomi remained still as applause filled the hall. The board behind her still bore the symbols of her victory, clean chalk lines that spoke louder than any speech. She didn't need to stand. She didn't need to gloat. The math had already told the story. Cartwright tried to swallow, but her voice was caught in her throat. She had planned for this moment to be Naomi's undoing, but now she sat as the silent witness to her triumph. She wanted to speak, to offer some clever spin, some rational excuse, but she couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The judges approached Naomi one by one. A professor from Stanford tapped her shoulder gently, his voice warm with admiration. "You didn't just win," he said. "You shifted how we understand the problem." A professor from Princeton shook his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anyone handle complexity with that kind of vision," he said. "You didn't just solve it. You elevated it." Naomi nodded respectfully, her expression measured. She hadn't come for applause. She had come for the truth. And now the truth stood behind her, written in chalk for all to see. Then something happened that shattered whatever composure was left in the room. From the steps at the front of the stage, 2 small figures ran forward, 2 little boys, barely taller than the judges' podiums. They bounded up onto the platform and threw their arms around Naomi's waist. "Mommy!" one of them cried. "You did it!" Naomi dropped to her knees, her arms circling both of them, clutching them tight as tears welled in her eyes. The crowd, already overwhelmed, fell into a stunned hush before erupting again, this time louder, fuller, and bursting with something deeper than applause. It wasn't just admiration now. It was love. It was joy. It was witnessing something holy. She held her sons as if the world outside them didn't exist. One pressed his cheek into her shoulder. The other whispered, "Can we get that new bunk bed now?" Naomi laughed through tears. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "Yes, we can." No one watching would ever forget it. The woman who had just made the greatest minds in mathematics stop and stare wasn't alone at the top. She had brought her children with her. She hadn't just cracked an impossible equation. She had rewritten what triumph looked like. Cartwright could only watch, stunned, as the narrative she had tried to control unraveled in front of her. Naomi Reed had not only changed the outcome of a competition, she had changed the entire landscape. She was no longer just a student in a hoodie. She was a symbol, a mother, a scholar, a storm. And as her sons held on to her, and the room thundered with standing ovations, Naomi finally stood, not because she needed to prove anything, but because the world was already standing with her. Wow, what a journey. You know, writing this story really shook something inside me. Naomi Reed isn't just a character. She's a symbol, a force, a reminder that brilliance doesn't come dressed in prestige or pedigree. It comes from grit, from resilience, from waking up at 3 a.m. to study with a baby monitor by your side, and still showing up to rewrite the rules in a room full of doubters. This story isn't just about math. It's about breaking through barriers that were never supposed to move. It's about fighting for a place at the table when the world keeps telling you it's already full. Naomi didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for anyone to believe in her. She just worked, silently, relentlessly, until the truth was so loud it couldn't be ignored. And maybe that's what hit me the most. That our worth is never defined by where we come from, but by how fiercely we move forward. Naomi didn't win just for herself. She won for every person who's ever been underestimated, for every mother told she couldn't, for every kid from the wrong neighborhood. She showed us that the system may be built with walls, but we build ladders. So now I want to hear from you. What did this story mean to you? Did it hit home? Did it remind you of someone in your life, or maybe yourself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk. Let's share. Let's remind each other that no one gets to decide our limits but us. And hey, if this story moved you even just a little, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us just how powerful we really are. Until next time, keep fighting your quiet battles, and never forget, your truth matters.